What's up, everybody? You are listening to the Credentials Unscripted podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sterenberg, and we've got another phenomenal episode for you today. This is episode 38. We're talking about the great value shift, a roadmap for delivering value in post-secondary education. This is a paper, some research published by ESG, and we're talking with Dr. Kenyatta Lovett from ESG, and great conversation, really smart guy, learned a lot. And essentially what we're highlighting is there is a growing distrust in higher ed. There's a greater skepticism of higher ed. How can higher ed begin to think about itself differently and deliver the value that learners are looking for? And so we talk about credentials of value, and he highlights how states, systems, and institutions can think about what they measure, how they can strategically bring people together, and ultimately think about the outcomes of higher ed. So great conversation. I think you'll learn a lot, and I'll put a link to the paper in the description of this episode as well. But without further ado, let's get to our conversation with Dr. Lovett. Here we go. All right, Dr. Kenyatta Lovett, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Matt. I'm glad to be here.
So I was, looking on LinkedIn and saw Melanie Booth post about this great value shift. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Let me click on this, and read up on a report, some research that all of you have done. And it's the great value shift, a roadmap for delivering value in post-secondary education. And I found it really fascinating. Tell me a little bit more about how this came to be and some of your work at ESG.
Sure. And again, thank you for having me. This all was a part of a discussion that's been evolving over the past, I'd say, 18 or 24 months, really beginning with the start of our work in this whole value movement with Colorado and supporting their work of building a framework. And even prior to that, actually, the ESG, we've supported a few states in developing their attainment goals, and we take a lot of pride in being supportive of the nation's attainment agenda that started, back in the early 2000s with Lumina planting a flag around a 60% goal. Several states then embarked on their own sort of vision. I worked in Tennessee at the time with the Drive to 55, trying to get to 55% attainment by 2025. And we recognized that there was an evolution of the attainment agenda that went just not only about credentials and just earning degrees, but really how does that matter in the larger ecosystem of the American fabric? And it was a question I actually received when Tennessee embarked on their goal, of a few employers asking me the question of, are we just producing a bunch of degrees to say that, yay, 60% or 55%, or are these going to be the right degrees that matter, not only to employers, but most importantly, to students and households? And so it was a really good question that I didn't have a full answer for, just hopeful that we would get to that outcome. And I think we've recognized over time that there's more that needs to be done in addition to just having a degree that actually will lead to the ultimate goal of higher education, which is around economic mobility. So about 2 years ago, we embarked on that with support for one state. Then we recognized that more states were having these conversations. There was a movement building up. Obviously, there was evidence, and you'll see in our report that, from Georgetown and their work in 2010, leading all the way up into today with Lumina refreshing their goal, and even the Carnegie classification recently being released that actually leans into value. We knew that this was going to be the new national direction, that we wanted to help to be, provide some light, shed some light to the field around what's possible, whether you are a state agency, you are a higher education system, or you're an institution. What's the role in making sure that we can make economic mobility more promising for students across the nation?
I really like how you framed that, because essentially what you're saying is we could reach our goals, but not realize the success that we actually thought the goals would give us, right? Like we're credentialing all these people, we hit our goal. What's the problem? And it's like, well, actually, let's dig down a layer deeper. Like, what is this leading to? Like the credentials of value is becoming more and more prevalent, because I think there's people that are just questioning the value of a credential or degree. And I'm going to read from the paper, which we'll put a link to this in the description of the episode. But here's a quote from your paper. Value in post-secondary can no longer be assumed. It must be proved and actively pursued. Why do you think that is? Like, it's a big question. Why? Like, because when Lumina came out with this, everyone was like, college. And there's a shift now where we need to actually prove this out. Why has this shift occurred in post-secondary education?
Yeah, I think for the longest, when you looked at a degree, it was the default proxy for skills in the marketplace for, high demand, high wage jobs, jobs that actually led to, considerable amount of mobility. That was just the standardized proxy. I think because data has become much more robust, you know, people out there, especially our young students, are a lot more savvy about their options and opportunities that are out there. And you combine that with this looming debt that's almost $2 trillion worth of debt from students who attempted, maybe they completed, but the real reality that college costed a considerable amount to engage with. All these factors sort of converge where it's not a foregone conclusion that if I earn a degree, it's the pathway to the American dream. It's not a foregone conclusion that if I go to this institution and earn that degree, that the return on investment will be stronger than another option. These things that we just dangerously assumed were part of the American fabric are not necessarily always true. And I think what's been really good is whether it's the legislature, definitely for students and even for employers, the challenge of the degree being that proxy has required to give some more details and nuance around it, of being able to demonstrate and explain that, not only to the people outside of the walls of higher education, but to higher education itself. Do we really truly know exactly what we're providing out there in the marketplace and what that looks like, beyond a student walking across the commencement stage?
Yeah, I think and when you think about the pursuit of the goal to get more students to college is great, but it also creates its own challenge, right? Like, we're opening up
Yeah,
access to all these other people, like the supply of people changes. And so underemployment becomes a real thing as you have more people with a bachelor's degree, for instance. So it's sort of like,
right.
in some ways problems of progress, but also important questions we need to address, because college is interesting. Like, we made this huge push. More people are going in a sense. It feels like we have more people that feel like they have access to college, but the costs haven't gone down, which doesn't seem to be like, from an economics point of view, it's like we have more people
That's right.
accessing, but the costs haven't gone down. So we just have more questions that we need to ask. But you have a really good framing in the paper of 3 shifts that you recommend for whether it's post-secondary institutions or systems or state leaders. And I want to just highlight those quickly, and then we'll go through them. You want people to coalesce stakeholders around a clear goal, commit to meaningful measures, and that one is my favorite one, and then align actions to drive post-secondary value. What does it mean to coalesce stakeholders around a clear goal? Because it obviously seems simple. It's like, yeah, we should bring people together, establish a clear goal. Let's dig into it a little bit. How do states, systems, and leaders actually make this a reality?
Yes, and I think uh, we've had a few of our clients have to back up as they are thinking about creating this new vision for their system or their state, and they're in recognition that typically the attainment conversation happened pretty much in a vacuum. Somewhat employers were getting engaged with this. It had some connection, obviously, to the legislature, but maybe or maybe not workforce development or economic development. When you start to expand this into attainment and value, it's not just the degrees, but what these degrees actually produce for the larger ecosystem. You have no choice but to bring in different actors, players, stakeholders, to figure out what's the right conversation we need to have in our state or in our system. And so coalescing around that is not an easy feat, because now you have to think about your workforce agency lead or your local workforce board. So you have to think about employers or regions or sectors, or you have to think about different types of student populations that see higher education in through different lenses, and coming together to say what matters the most for higher education as a system and its products, is a conversation that probably most people wouldn't anticipate would be a very robust and comprehensive conversation around the different nuances that get at poverty, economic mobility, you name it, where the economy is going next. What are we going to do about the cost of college? What are the barriers that are out there for students or for completion? What are the things that employers are grappling with the most that degrees don't actually provide? And coming and having those robust discussions with leaders and stakeholders, I think, is definitely we see as the most important first step, but one that's very different than what's happened in the past.
Yeah, you have different communities, right? You have different entities, different organizations. You have a regional comprehensive 4-year. Like, what are
Yeah.
your goals for your students? You have a community college. Then you have like global brand, like University of Texas at Austin, right? Like each
Yes.
one of those should have a different, who are we serving? What are our goals for these students or for our learners? And I think so often we just kind of go, all right, graduation. And it's like, to what end? Right. So what jobs are we actually leading to? And you highlight the Texas example where they years ago shifted their model to kind of a dynamic outcomes based model where they are incentivizing completion, degree completion, credential completion, but then also it's credentials of value. And that's kind of a theme that keeps coming up in your report is the states that are thinking about credentials of value. You mentioned Hawaii as well in the paper, but like the feedback loop to learners to me is such a critical piece where do I know what this credential will get me?
Right.
What does this lead to? What is the pathway so that I can actually make an informed choice as a learner, which thinking about my experience many, many years ago, right? Like I had no idea what jobs earned, what was going to lead to that employment opportunity, really had no concept of it. And I think because higher ed hasn't had to answer the value conversation for many, many years, now we're getting to this point, and I think it actually can lead to better experience for learners because they're going to have more transparency of choice and understand the trade-offs that they're making when they make an investment in education.
Yeah. I mean, you think about the college search process. It in the past was more related to the brand, right, of the institution, and the brand then could demand different types of value out there, whether it's the cost that tuition that people would say, yeah, that's worth it because of the brand. Sometimes you could get to a program, right, that was the nation's best program, but really it wasn't nuanced beyond that. You knew about maybe strong programs, but not the ones that were weaker, right? This new landscape pulls that totally apart and allows for a much deeper conversation, not only about the institution or its programs, but in comparison to other programs and other institutions collectively, and even a different conversation around skills, right? And, I can use the example of me going to college. I wanted to design cars. Had no clue of what that looked like. I just knew it was cool. I wrote the editors of Car and Driver and Road and Track magazine back in the day, and they surprisingly wrote me back and gave me a list of the institutions and what that major was, right? And I kind of blindly went through this pathway, not realizing that, wait a minute, there are no jobs in Tennessee where I can actually be a car designer. I never thought about that part of it, but I wanted to live in Tennessee. And now you have much more robust systems for students and households to really think about what people really want to do, what are the skills that are necessary, and what are the pathways of getting there. I think you bring up a really, really good point of with this robust information, what we recognize it's a missing piece also in this movement is making sure that it's digestible for families and households to make those informed decisions. But the great thing is now the data that I had, which was basically a couple of magazines that inspired me of a career that I wanted to go into, and a letter and a list of colleges, and to get catalogs back through the mail, to now, you can sit down as an advisor with a student, really get at the heart of what they want to do and give them a plethora of options that may be four-year institutions, it may be a community college, it may even be a technical college, that can also outline what happens at the end of the road for you when you complete that degree or credential. What wages can you expect? For me, it was a guessing game, and once I got out of college, reality set in of exactly what I signed up for. Not necessarily so for students today, and I think that's a good thing for higher education overall.
You brought up the brand piece, which I think is so interesting. Like what you're essentially making the point in your second shift, which is commit to more meaningful measures, which I think is awesome because the brand piece, what I think of when I worked in admissions 15 years ago, and it was like, we want to be on the U.S. News and World Report or the Princeton Review, and it's all these things that are their rankings, their brand.
Yes.
Very little understanding of what they mean, what contributes to it, right? It's you're put on a list. And I think that's kind of the problem, right? Is we're pursuing brand, we're pursuing, recognition without any clear idea of what the outcomes are. And you even highlight this. You have basically 4 different things to measure: post-secondary attainment,
Yep.
labor market outcomes, ROI, what it costs you to basically get that outcome,
Yep.
and wealth accumulation. And I think that's the framing that states and institutions would benefit from, because then it becomes like brand is this ethereal thing. Like what is brand? It's kind of an affinity thing. It's recognizable. Like a lot of students are going to apply to colleges because they like the SEC, or they're recognized. Oh, I like watching Longhorns football games. Like there's not always a deeper connection. And I think the pursuit of these measures will allow states to know what to invest in and be able to track where success comes from.
That's right. That's right. And actually demonstrates something back to, their residents of why this investment at the state level or this investment at the national level is so important for the fabric of our nation. And you'll see, definitely, I think you've read through it, building these measures in different ways is giving a different conversation to students. Back to your point of just understanding the brand. We liked one aspect of that institution, never thought about the entirety of what it provides to us until we actually engage with it by enrolling or graduating. What you'll see in this continuum that we provided is, this is a discussion that can be had around the totality of what higher education brings to families and households that can be highly transformative, and not just rhetoric of saying, we're changing households and families and people's income and economic mobility. We'll prove that on paper and prove that through data. And I think what's really promising is we do have data systems that can demonstrate in very meaningful ways what this provides. And so these 4 different points that you mentioned, where we see and what we've learned, at least from our analysis, are the things I think that are matter the most. And we hope that states and higher education systems will be very serious about incorporating those and putting those in a transparent way to, families and households.
Where have you seen states and systems work together to make meaningful change based on having good data? Because, if you're just an institution out there looking at these going, okay, we agree on what we should measure here: outcomes, ROI, wealth accumulation, attainment. Great. Those are all fantastic things we've been trying to do. But at a state level, you want to understand this. Systems have to cooperate. Where have you seen states and systems work together to actually measure these things to make progress?
Yeah, you mentioned a really good example of Texas and what they've been able to pull off. And this was House Bill 8 that you're referring to. House Bill 8 essentially was the revised community college funding mechanism that hadn't been revisited for 50 years. But you can go back a few years prior to that, and the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board established a new vision of how they wanted to set the tone for the state. It used to be called 60 by 30 Texas. They changed that to building a talent strong Texas. In that, you'll see a lot of different components that House Bill 8 is really sort of an offshoot of that. But again, they're coming together to say, one, we want to make sure that we reduce we want to improve the affordability for students. And if you look at building a talent strong Texas, there's a vision and goal of making sure that students don't walk out with debt. Two, they recognize that this needs to be something that's more for not just for high school students, but also for adults and other types of learners. And so they sort of created that vision as well. The other one was just really around credentials of value. It's just making sure that it's tied more directly to workforce outcomes that can actually improve ROI. You put all that together, and then you have this really amazing committee that they formed to explore community college funding. And they have basically the framework or the foundation to go ahead and start to think about what's next for the Texas community college system. And they create basically House Bill 8, which then those sort of the major piece of that is really the credentials of value movement, which is where most states have yet to go, which is we're going to fund institutions based on the degrees, not just about completion, but these degrees and what they mean for students beyond completion to make sure that they get into jobs and earn living wages, and that the ROI is actually to their favor and not something in the inverse. And so I say Texas is a prime example of taking that framework and actually putting it into full action where you can see it in funding and outcomes. And even today, I just had a conversation with a Texas institution who's thinking about where their rankings were, back to the rankings you mentioned of getting on a list. The rankings really deal with finances in terms of how are we faring out in our credentials of value, and what does that mean for our bottom line, and what about our competitors or our peers, right, our other community colleges, and why are they gaining so much on credentials of value? What can we do to improve? I think what you're getting at is you're saying to create a system like that where it's a little bit more competitive, and actually produces a better, larger ecosystem where everyone's looking to see how can we better serve students in a way that matters, because the state has set up a vision or a goal around things that they know are in the best interest of the state, which is ensuring that Texans have higher education that's accessible, but also produces outcomes that are beneficial to their households and to their own personal economy.
We've seen this firsthand at Parchment too. We work with California and the Texas Higher Ed Coordinating Board on course sharing initiatives. So the ability to take classes at other institutions outside of your home college. I may not have a class that's available to me at my home college this semester, but I really need to take it to complete on time. I can take it at a nearby community college. And the reason we're working with those states is because they moved to a completion funding model, right? Or credential completion funding model. So I just think it's cool that the state makes a decision, and then you can see kind of the policy impacts of what they're willing to invest in, and they're incentivizing collaboration. And they're basically like the system's actually working together because the incentives are in the right place, which I think is absolutely fantastic.
You highlight in a good way in the document. You'll see our three different shifts. Without all three, you're missing a piece. And I think what you highlight the most is if you don't coalesce around a goal first, creating those measures actually loses a lot of its impact and potential if you don't first have everyone in agreement and marching in the same direction.
And the credentials of value thing, it's a trust builder. So if you're in labor right now, you might look at certain credentials and say, there's no value to us, or we don't trust it. When a state says, these are credentials of value, this is what labor says is important, and then you end up producing those individuals, those credentials, and they say, yes, we're going to hire this person. We value that. And then they begin to trust the educational ecosystem again. And then they're going to make further investments. And by nature of them trusting the credentials, like there's more interaction, more cooperation, and there's just a more inherent value in all credentials at that point because, we trust that institution is doing the right thing to prepare students for the next step in their educational professional journey. So I think that's a really cool byproduct of this work, is that you're building trust between education and labor. And that's basically what you highlight today, is that we have to prove that there's value here based
Yes.
on this gap.
Yeah. Yes. And we see a few states going in that direction. And I'll note Louisiana is another one that I think is starting to move really quickly into that direction. And you mentioned the partnership with labor and workforce. Their workforce agency for the Louisiana Board of Regents, the workforce agency has created, certain star jobs in terms of the demand and the outcomes and the wages. And they have, partnered with that workforce agency to sort of create their own credentials of value. But it is this partnership that eventually you start to see everyone coming together and rowing in the same direction. And you're right, you're building a trust system that really is combating this challenge that we have right now, where people are questioning, is higher education worth it? And I think this is a very timely and immediate response to that, of saying, not only is it worth it, we're working to prove it even more and more through the collaborative work that we're carrying out.
So, Dr. Lovett, put yourself in the position, you're a state administrator, someone who's working in higher ed at the state level. What challenges do you expect to run into? What hurdles? What things have you seen in your work with states that people need to be prepared for? Like, what are the objections? Because higher ed is complex. The incentives, the collaboration, cooperation, then legislators, the political climate. Like, what can you expect, and what have you seen people do to overcome some of these challenges?
Sure. You're talking about shift three, right? Which is turning this into action. The first one that I think is the biggest barrier is, going beyond creating the metrics. And what does that mean at the institution level? What types of transformation are going to happen there? Obviously, you're talking about academic programs that now are under a different lens or a different level of scrutiny of, is this producing good ROI for students or is it not? And so you can see the enormous amount of pushback that's out there, whether it's faculty or the members of academic affairs or even institutions themselves, are saying, great that you've got this framework. Can we just not go as far into the implementation because you're getting into our lane? What I've seen that's been very promising is that people have been able to change the narrative of this conversation. One, to do a really important thing, which is to debunk a ton of myths that this new credentials of value movement is going to be to the detriment of liberal arts programs in education. And if you look at the data that we've seen from different parts of the state, you recognize that there are a lot of liberal arts programs that are under supply and high demand and high wage. And so it's not just the computer scientist or the engineer that we're saying credentials of value, but it's a much more robust mix of programs and courses. The question you have to ask is why is it there a high demand for history graduates in our region or English graduates, and what does that mean, and what can we do to other programs to make sure that they have good ROI or good outcomes? And so